December 4, 1950, Chosin Reservoir, North Korea, temperature, minus 35 degrees Celsius. 6 American nurses were separated from their medical unit during one of the most brutal retreats in military history. They had no weapons, no radio, no hope of rescue, and then the Chinese People's Volunteer Army found them. What happened next went against everything both sides had been told to expect. This is their story, and it's not what you think. Before we understand what happened to these nurses, you need to understand the war they were fighting. The Korean War has been called the Forgotten War, sandwiched between World War II and Vietnam. It killed over 2.5 million people in just 3 years. But most people today couldn't tell you a single battle from it. They couldn't name a single general besides MacArthur. They couldn't point to Chosin Reservoir on a map, and that's exactly the problem. Because what happened in Korea would shape the next 70 years of global politics, and we've somehow managed to forget almost all of it. It started in June 1950 when North Korean forces, backed by Stalin and Mao, crossed the 38th parallel. The invasion was sudden, brutal, and coordinated. Within days, Seoul had fallen. Within weeks, the South Korean army was in complete disarray. By September, South Korea and the small American force there were trapped in the Pusan perimeter, a tiny pocket of land with their backs to the sea. Military analysts in Washington were already discussing evacuation plans. The war looked lost. Then General MacArthur pulled off one of history's most audacious moves, the Incheon landing. Against the advice of almost every military expert, he landed 75,000 troops at Incheon, deep behind enemy lines, in a harbor that most considered impossible to assault. It worked. The North Korean supply lines collapsed overnight. Within weeks, UN forces had pushed the invaders back across the 38th parallel and kept going. By late October, American troops were at the Yalu River, the border with China. MacArthur promised the troops they'd be home by Christmas. He told President Truman the war was essentially over. He was catastrophically wrong. On October 19, 1950, something unprecedented was happening along the Yalu River. Under cover of darkness, 300,000 Chinese soldiers were crossing into North Korea. They moved at night, hid during the day, maintained complete radio silence. American reconnaissance planes flew overhead and saw nothing. The UN forces had no idea they were there. Intelligence estimates put Chinese troop strength at maybe 30,000 to 40,000 soldiers maximum. They were off by a factor of 10. And then winter came early, one of the coldest on record. Temperatures at Chosin Reservoir would drop to minus 40 degrees Fahrenheit. That's cold enough that exposed skin freezes in under a minute. Cold enough that vehicle engines seized up even when running. Cold enough that when soldiers were shot, their blood froze before they could bleed out. The soldiers weren't issued proper winter gear. They had summer uniforms with light jackets. Their boots weren't insulated. They had no cold weather sleeping bags. The supply chain simply hadn't anticipated fighting a winter war in the mountains of North Korea. Weapons froze. M1 Garands wouldn't fire because the firing pins froze in place. Mortar cracked from the cold. Morphine froze in syringes, so medics had to thaw it under their armpits before they could inject wounded men. Men lost fingers trying to fire their rifles with bare hands. Some lost entire hands to frostbite. Medical records from Chosin show that frostbite casualties outnumbered combat casualties 3 to 1. For every man shot, 3 more were evacuated because they'd frozen. And in the middle of this frozen hell was Chosin Reservoir, where 30,000 UN troops, mostly US Marines and Army soldiers, were about to be surrounded by 120,000 Chinese soldiers. What followed would become legendary in military history. The fighting retreat from Chosin Reservoir, 78 miles through mountain passes in sub-zero temperatures while completely surrounded. The Marines would lose 718 men killed in action, over 3,000 wounded, and nearly 7,000 casualties from frostbite. But the stories you've heard are about the Marines. The combat troops, the men who fought their way out. This story is about the people who were trying to save them. In 1950, being a military nurse was considered one of the most prestigious positions a woman could hold. These weren't just caregivers, they were officers. Lieutenants and captains who'd trained for years in combat medicine, who'd studied battlefield surgery and trauma care, who knew how to work under conditions that would break most people. The Army Nurse Corps had strict standards. You needed a nursing degree from an accredited program. You needed to pass a physical fitness test designed for combat conditions. You needed to demonstrate you could make life-or-death decisions under extreme pressure. And you needed to volunteer, because they didn't draft nurses. By November 1950, there were 540 Army nurses serving in Korea. They worked 16-hour shifts in mobile Army surgical hospitals, MASH units, the same ones that would later inspire the famous TV show. But the TV show got one thing very wrong. It wasn't funny. There were no laugh tracks in the real MASH units. There was just blood, and screaming, and the smell of gangrene, and nurses working until they literally collapsed from exhaustion. Nurses at Chosin treated soldiers with limbs frozen solid, so cold that when you tried to remove clothing the flesh came off with it. They treated men who'd been shot and then lay in the snow for hours, their wounds packed with ice, their core body temperatures so low they should have been dead. They treated Marines with frostbite so severe their boots had to be cut off, taking toes and sometimes entire feet with them. They performed amputations by flashlight. They gave blood transfusions while mortar rounds landed outside. They triaged wounded men knowing that some of them were going to die because there simply weren't enough supplies or time to save everyone. And they almost never talked about it afterward. Because what do you say? How do you explain to someone who wasn't there what it's like to decide which 19-year-old kid gets the last unit of plasma and which one doesn't? Our story focuses on 6 nurses, whose real names we're keeping private out of respect for their families and the classified nature of some of the events. We'll call them Lieutenant Davis, Lieutenant Park, Captain Morrison, Lieutenant Chen, Lieutenant Walsh, and Lieutenant Robinson. 5 were white Americans from small towns across the country. Farm girls and factory workers' daughters who'd put themselves through nursing school and then volunteered for military service. 1. Lieutenant Park was Korean-American, born in California to immigrant parents, fluent in both English and Korean. She'd faced discrimination her entire life, people questioning her loyalty, assuming she was the enemy. But she'd volunteered anyway, determined to prove she was just as American as anyone else. They'd been serving together for 3 months by December 1950. They'd become close in the way people do when they share trauma. They knew each other's stories, each other's fears, each other's breaking points. On December 3, 1950, their MASH unit received orders to evacuate south immediately. The Chinese offensive had broken through the defensive lines. UN forces were in full retreat. Intelligence reported that Chinese units were moving south faster than anyone had anticipated. If they didn't move now, they'd be cut off. The evacuation was chaos. Wounded men being loaded onto trucks and helicopters. Medical equipment being packed or abandoned, files being burned. Everyone knew what being captured by the Chinese meant, or thought they knew. But there was a problem. The evacuation wasn't coordinated properly. Units were supposed to move in convoy with military escort, but the timing got messed up. Some units left early, some left late. Radio communication was spotty because of the mountains. The nurses' convoy got separated during a night movement. It was snowing heavily, visibility was almost zero. 6 nurses ended up into ambulances that took a wrong turn at a mountain pass in a complete whiteout snowstorm. By the time they realized their mistake, they'd been driving the wrong direction for over an hour. By dawn on December 4th, they were alone. No radio contact because their radio had frozen and stopped working. No map because it had been in the lead vehicle they'd lost contact with. No weapons except one M1 carbine with 15 rounds that Lieutenant Walsh had grabbed, plus to point for 5 pistols with 1 magazine each. And they were 12 miles behind enemy lines, in hostile territory, in the middle of the worst winter Korea had seen in decades. Lieutenant Davis, the ranking officer in their group, tried to stay calm. She'd been through worse, she told herself. She'd survived being stationed in the Philippines when the Japanese invaded in 1941, had spent 3 years in an internment camp. She knew how to survive, but this was different. They were in the open, in vehicles that could be spotted from miles away. They had maybe a day's worth of rations, the temperature was dropping. And every minute they stayed where they were, Chinese forces were getting closer. Lieutenant Davis made the decision to keep moving south, following what they hoped was the main supply route. They drove slowly, trying to minimize engine noise. Any loud sound could give away their position. They avoided the main roads when possible, cutting through fields and forest paths, hoping they were heading in the right direction. The two ambulances stayed close together. Lieutenant Walsh drove the lead vehicle. Lieutenant Robinson navigated with a compass. Behind them, Lieutenant Park drove the second ambulance with Captain Morrison riding shotgun, literally, with the M1 carbine across her lap. At 11:47 a.m., disaster struck. The lead ambulance hit a patch of black ice on a downhill slope, completely invisible under a thin layer of fresh snow. Lieutenant Walsh did everything right. She didn't brake hard or overcorrect, but physics doesn't care about training. The ambulance slid sideways, then forward, then off the road entirely into a drainage ditch. The crash wasn't violent, just a sickening crunch as the front axle snapped and the engine died. Nobody was hurt, but the vehicle was completely disabled. The front wheels were at an angle that made it clear they weren't driving it out of there, even if they could get it back on the road. Captain Morrison, the senior officer, assessed their options quickly. They were down to one vehicle. They could all cram into it, 6 women plus supplies, but it would be overloaded, slow, obvious. The ambulance would be riding so low that it might not make it over rough terrain. And if something happened to that vehicle, they'd all be stranded. Or they could split up, for nurses would take the working ambulance and make a run for UN lines. 2 would stay with the disabled vehicle and its medical supplies, hiding until rescue could be arranged or until they could be sure the area was safe. It was a terrible choice. Splitting up meant half the group might never be found. Staying together meant risking everyone in an overloaded vehicle that might break down or be spotted. Captain Morrison made the call. She was the ranking officer. It was her responsibility. 4 would go, 2 would stay. She asked for volunteers to stay. Lieutenant Park raised her hand immediately. She spoke Korean and some Mandarin, she argued. If they encountered locals or Chinese soldiers, she might be able to talk their way out of it. And she knew how to survive in winter conditions. Her family used to go camping in the Sierra Nevada mountains every winter when she was growing up. Lieutenant Chen volunteered as well. She was the best field surgeon in the unit, she said. If one of them got injured, they'd need someone who could handle it. Plus, she was small, she wouldn't take up much space or use many supplies. Captain Morrison didn't like it, but she couldn't argue with the logic. She gave Lieutenant Park the M1 carbine and both pistols. She gave them extra rations, extra blankets, everything they could spare. She told them to wait 24 hours. If UN forces didn't retake the area by then, they should try to make it south on foot, staying off the roads. The 4 nurses loaded into the working ambulance. Lieutenant Park and Lieutenant Chen stood in the snow and watched them drive away, the sound of the engine fading into the distance, swallowed by the wind and the vast white silence of the Korean winter. And then they were truly alone. They dragged supplies out of the disabled ambulance and set up a makeshift shelter inside it, hanging blankets over the windows for concealment. Lieutenant Chen wanted to light a small fire for warmth, but Lieutenant Park vetoed it. Smoke could be seen for miles. They'd have to stay cold. At 2:33 p.m., they heard it, voices, speaking Chinese. Lieutenant Park froze. She'd been outside the ambulance, checking the road for any sign of friendly forces. She scrambled back behind the vehicle and motioned frantically to Lieutenant Chen to stay quiet and stay down. The voices were getting closer. Lieutenant Park, who spoke some Mandarin from her grandmother who taught her as a child, listened carefully. She could make out maybe every 3rd or 4th word. Patrol, scout, Americans, south. It was a Chinese patrol. At least 20 soldiers, maybe more, and they were coming right toward them. The nurses had maybe 90 seconds before the patrol would crest the small rise and see the ambulance sitting there in the ditch. They had 3 choices. 1. Run into the mountains. But they'd leave obvious tracks in the snow that anyone could follow, and they'd freeze to death by nightfall without shelter or supplies. 2. Try to hide in the ambulance and hope the Chinese didn't search it thoroughly. But that was almost guaranteed to fail. 3. Surrender. Lieutenant Chen grabbed the M1 carbine. Her hands were shaking, but her voice was steady. "We can fight," she whispered. "We can take a few of them before ... double quotes." Lieutenant Park put her hand on the barrel and pushed it down. She looked at Lieutenant Chen for a long moment. They both knew what capture might mean. the stories they'd heard. The rumors, the warnings, but fighting meant dying. And dying meant never seeing home again. Never seeing their families, never having a chance. Lieutenant Park made a decision that would save both their lives. She took a medical bandage from her coat, a long strip of white gauze, and tied it to a wooden splint. A makeshift white flag. She checked that her uniform showed the Red Cross clearly. She made sure her rank insignia was visible, and then she stepped out from behind the ambulance. Into the open, into full view of anyone coming over that rise. With her hands raised above her head, one hand holding the white flag. Lieutenant Chen watched her go, rifle still in hand, every muscle tensed. She wanted to follow. She wanted to pull Lieutenant Park back. She wanted to do anything except watch her friend walk toward what might be her death. But she stayed, because someone had to stay with the supplies. Someone had to be the backup plan if this went wrong. 20 Chinese soldiers appeared over the rise. They saw Lieutenant Park standing there, alone, hands up, white flag waving in the wind. For a moment, nobody moved. The Chinese soldiers were as surprised as she was terrified. Then every rifle came up, 20 weapons aimed at one woman. To understand what happened next, you need to know what both sides believed about each other. American troops had been told the Chinese were fanatics, brainwashed communists who took no prisoners and showed no mercy. They'd been shown propaganda photos of massacres, told stories of prisoners being tortured and executed, warned that surrender meant death. Some of this was true. There had been brutal massacres on both sides. War crimes committed by both Chinese and UN forces. Villages burned, prisoners shot, civilians caught in the crossfire and killed indiscriminately. The Korean War was not a clean war. There were no clean wars. But Chinese soldiers had been told something worse about Americans. They were told American soldiers were monsters who burned villages for sport, who murdered civilians without hesitation, who had no honor and no humanity. They were told that Americans saw all Asians as subhuman, as targets to be eliminated. And they were specifically warned about one thing, that female American personnel were not really medical staff. The Chinese command believed, or claimed to believe, that American nurses were intelligence officers using the Red Cross as cover, that they were spies gathering information, that they were combatants disguised as medical personnel. The Geneva Convention said medical staff should be treated as non-combatants, but both sides had already violated the Geneva Conventions in multiple ways. The rules of war, such as they were, had broken down weeks ago. So when that Chinese patrol saw Lieutenant Park standing there with her hands up, wearing an American uniform, claiming to be a nurse, they had every reason to believe this was a trap. That there were soldiers hidden nearby, that this was some kind of ambush. That if they approached, they'd be shot. The patrol leader was a man we'll call Captain Wang. His real name has been lost to history, or perhaps deliberately obscured in Chinese military records. But we know some things about him from the debriefs and reports that followed. He'd been fighting since 1946, first against the Japanese occupation in the final days of World War II, then in the Chinese Civil War, where he'd fought for the communists against the nationalists in battles that killed millions, and now in Korea, in this frozen nightmare, leading a patrol of young soldiers who'd never seen combat before, most of them farm boys from Sichuan province who'd been conscripted months earlier and barely knew how to fire their rifles. He'd seen things that would break most men. He'd seen his friends killed. He'd killed men himself, up close, with bayonets and grenades and sometimes just his bare hands. He'd learned to shed off the part of his brain that felt empathy, because empathy got you killed in war. He walked up to Lieutenant Park, rifle raised and aimed at her chest. His finger was on the trigger, one twitch and she'd be dead. He looked at her face. She was terrified, trying not to show it, but he could see it in her eyes, in the way her hands were shaking slightly even though she was trying to hold them steady. And then he did something that surprised everyone, including himself. He lowered his weapon, slowly, deliberately. He raised his hand to stop his soldiers from advancing further. They looked confused, but they obeyed. That was the difference between experienced soldiers and new recruits. The experienced ones understood that sometimes the unexpected decision was the right one. Captain Wang studied Lieutenant Park for a long moment. He saw the Red Cross on her uniform. He saw the medical bag at her feet. He saw that she was alone, or appeared to be, that she had no weapon visible. And in broken English, learned from a missionary school he'd attended as a child in Shanghai before the wars came, before everything changed, he said 3 words that would alter the course of the next 16 hours. "You are nurse." His accent was thick, but the words were clear. Lieutenant Park nodded. She didn't trust herself to speak. She pointed to the red cross on her uniform, with one hand while keeping the other raised. Then she pointed back toward the ambulance, where Lieutenant Chen had now also stepped out, also with her hands raised, also showing the red cross clearly. Captain Wang stared at them for what felt like an eternity but was probably only 30 seconds. He was making a calculation. A risk assessment. This could still be a trap. They could be bait. There could be American soldiers hidden nearby waiting to ambush his patrol. But something in his gut told him it wasn't a trap. Something in the way these women stood there, unarmed and terrified but not running, not fighting, just standing there with their hands up and their white flag waving. And then he did something completely unexpected. Something that went against his training and his orders and every lesson he'd learned in for years of war. He bowed, just slightly. A gesture of respect that was more instinct than conscious decision, a remnant of his upbringing in a culture that valued courtesy even in the midst of chaos. And in Chinese, he said something his soldiers heard clearly. "Ifsheng shu shensheng de," doctors are sacred. It was an old saying, one that predated communism and the revolution, one that came from Confucian traditions about the value of those who heal. In Chinese culture, doctors and healers had traditionally been afforded respect and protection, even during war. He was choosing to honor that tradition, even though it might get him court-martialed, even though it might be seen as weakness, even though it was technically against his orders to show mercy to enemy personnel. He gestured to his soldiers. 2 of them moved forward carefully, weapons still ready but no longer aimed directly at the nurses. They searched the area around the ambulance quickly and professionally. They found the M1 carbine and the 2 pistols, which they took. They confirmed there were no other American personnel nearby. Then Captain Wang spoke to the nurses again, in his broken English. "You come, safe, no hurt." What happened over the next 16 hours has been documented in military debriefs, personal letters that Lieutenant Park and Lieutenant Chen wrote years later, and declassified intelligence reports that took decades to be released. The Chinese patrol took the 2 nurses to their temporary encampment, about 2 miles north of where they'd been found. It wasn't much, just a collection of tents hidden in a tree line, camouflaged from aerial observation. The nurses were not treated as prisoners. They were not bound, not locked up, not guarded in the way you'd guard captured enemy soldiers. Instead, they were brought to the largest tent and given hot tea, real tea. Actual leaves steeped in hot water, not the horrible instant coffee the Americans drank or the melted snow the Chinese soldiers usually had to settle for. Tea was rationed and precious. The fact that they were given tea meant something. It meant they were guests, not prisoners. They were given blankets. Heavy wool blankets that smelled of wood smoke and dirt but were warm and dry. 3 Chinese soldiers gave up their own blankets to make sure the nurses wouldn't freeze. Those soldiers would spend the night in the cold, sharing blankets with their comrades, because they'd decided these American nurses needed the warmth more. And then Captain Wang, through a translator, a young soldier who'd studied English in Beijing before the war, asked Lieutenant Chen a question. "Can you help our wounded?" It was asked as a question, not an order. He was asking, not demanding, giving them a choice. The Chinese unit had 14 wounded men. Some with frostbite, some with infected wounds from battles days earlier. Some with fevers that suggested sepsis. They had almost no medical supplies. The Chinese logistics in Korea were terrible. Soldiers often went days without food. Medicine was almost non-existent. Several of the wounded men were dying. Everyone knew it. They just didn't know how long it would take, or how much pain they'd be in before the end came. Now, technically, according to the Geneva Conventions, medical personnel couldn't be forced to treat enemy soldiers. They had the right to refuse. They could claim that doing so would violate their oath to their own military. But the Geneva Conventions also said that medical personnel should provide care regardless of nationality when possible. That the duty to heal transcended political and military boundaries. That a wounded person was just a wounded person, regardless of which uniform they wore. Lieutenant Park and Lieutenant Chen looked at each other. They didn't speak. They didn't need to. They'd worked together long enough to communicate with just a glance. They were thinking about a lot of things in that moment. About their duty as soldiers. About their duty as nurses. About their own safety. About what might happen if they refused. About what it meant to give medical care to men who hours earlier had been trying to kill American soldiers. But mostly they were thinking about those 14 wounded men, and how they were the only people in that camp who had the skills and supplies to help them. Lieutenant Chen spoke first. "We'll help," she said. "But we need our supplies from the ambulance." Captain Wang sent for soldiers to retrieve everything they needed. The soldiers carried it carefully, recognizing that this medical equipment might save their friends' lives. For the next 6 hours, Lieutenant Park and Lieutenant Chen treated those Chinese soldiers. They worked by firelight and flashlight. They used supplies from their ambulance, supplies that were meant for American wounded, knowing that somewhere American soldiers might be dying because these supplies weren't there. But they'd made their choice. They cleaned wounds that had been festering for days. They administered what antibiotics they had, knowing they didn't have enough to complete full courses for everyone. They taught Chinese medics how to properly dress frostbite wounds, how to prevent infection, how to recognize the signs of sepsis before it was too late. Lieutenant Chen performed an emergency surgery to remove shrapnel from a soldier's leg. The shrapnel was from an American mortar round, pieces of metal that had been sitting in his leg for 3 days, surrounded by infected tissue. Without surgery, he would die. With surgery, he had a chance. She performed the operation by firelight because they couldn't risk using brighter lights that might be spotted by American reconnaissance planes. She used improvised tools because proper surgical instruments had been lost or left behind in the retreat. She worked with hands that were numb from cold, making incisions by feel as much as sight. The Chinese soldiers watched in silence. They watched these American women, these enemy personnel, fighting to save Chinese lives with the same intensity and skill they would have used for their own wounded. Several of the soldiers were teenagers, 17, 18 years old. Farm boys who'd been conscripted and sent to a war they didn't understand, in cold they'd never experienced, fighting for reasons that had been explained to them in political terms they didn't fully grasp. They were a long way from home, scared and cold and wounded, and these American nurses were treating them like they mattered. At one point, Lieutenant Park later wrote in her diary, one of the young soldiers, a boy who couldn't have been more than 19, showed her a photo of his family, his parents and 2 younger sisters, standing in front of a small farmhouse somewhere in rural China. He pointed to each person and said their names in Chinese. She didn't speak enough Mandarin to understand everything, but she understood the emotion behind it. She pulled out her own photo, her family in California. Her parents who'd immigrated before she was born, her 2 brothers, who'd also served in the military, one in Europe and one in the Pacific during World War II. She pointed to each person and said their names. The young Chinese soldier smiled. A genuine smile, probably his first in weeks. He said something in Chinese that she didn't understand, but the translator nearby said quietly, "He says your family looks kind." For a moment, they weren't enemies. They weren't American and Chinese, capitalist and communist, opposing sides in a war for the future of Asia. They were just 2 people, far from home, trying to survive, sharing the universal human experience of missing the people they loved. At dawn on December 5th, Captain Wang approached the nurses. Through the translator, he told them his orders. His unit was supposed to move north and engage American forces at a specific location, part of a larger Chinese offensive. They were already late because they'd stopped to deal with the wounded. He would have his men escort the nurses south for 2 miles, to a location where they'd likely encounter UN patrols. Then the Chinese soldiers would leave, before they got close enough to risk combat with American forces. Lieutenant Park asked the question that had been bothering her since the previous afternoon. "Why are you doing this?" Captain Wang looked at her for a long moment. Then he spoke in Chinese, and the translator hesitated before translating, like he wasn't sure he should say it. "Because you treated my men like they were your men. You could have refused, you could have done the minimum. But you fought for their lives like they were your own soldiers. That kind of honor deserves to be answered with honor." He paused, then added something else, "And because I'm tired of killing. I've been fighting for years, I'm so tired of killing." When I have a chance to save lives instead, even American lives, I take it. Maybe that makes me a bad communist. But it makes me a human being. The translator said he wasn't supposed to say that last part, but Captain Wang didn't care anymore. Lieutenant Park and Lieutenant Chen were found by a Marine patrol on December 5th at 9:14 a.m. They were 2 miles south of where the Chinese had left them, walking along the ridge line and waving a white flag so they wouldn't be shot by their own side. The Marines were suspicious at first. To nurses appearing out of nowhere, claiming they'd been protected by Chinese soldiers. It sounded like a trap, or a trick, or propaganda. They were brought back to UN lines and immediately debriefed by intelligence officers. The debriefing lasted 7 hours. Every detail was questioned, every claim examined. The officers didn't quite believe their story at first. It didn't fit the narrative either side wanted to tell about the war. Americans wanted to believe the Chinese were brutal savages. The Chinese wanted to believe Americans were imperialist monsters. The idea that soldiers on both sides might be capable of humanity, of mercy, of recognizing shared values even across the divide of war, that was dangerous to both narratives. Their report was classified immediately, stamped secret and locked away. It didn't fit the narrative either side wanted to tell. The Korean War was supposed to be about good versus evil, democracy versus communism, freedom versus tyranny. It wasn't supposed to be complicated. It wasn't supposed to have moments where the enemy showed mercy, where ideological opponents recognized each other's humanity. The report would remain classified for 40 years. It would only be partially declassified in the 1990s, and even then, heavily redacted. The names of the nurses were removed. The name of Captain Wang, if it was ever recorded, was removed. Most of the details were removed. But the core story remained, buried in an archive that almost nobody ever accessed. The Korean War would go on for another 2.5 years. 2.5 million dead, millions more displaced. Villages destroyed, families separated, an entire peninsula scarred by a conflict that technically never ended, just paused, with a demilitarized zone that's still there today, 70 years later. Chosin Reservoir would become legendary, the Marines who fought their way out against overwhelming odds. The frozen Chosin, one of the greatest fighting retreats in military history. Books would be written about it. Movies would be made. Veterans would gather every year to remember their fallen comrades, but nobody talked about the nurses. Nobody talked about the moments of mercy that happened in the middle of the brutality. Because those stories were complicated, and war demands simple narratives. We don't know what happened to Captain Wang. Chinese military records from that period are incomplete. Many were destroyed during the Cultural Revolution in the 1960s. Many were never kept in the first place because the Chinese military in Korea was poorly organized and undersupplied. He may have died at Chosin in the fighting that followed. Many Chinese soldiers did. The casualties on the Chinese side were enormous, far worse than the Americans suffered. Or he may have survived and lived to old age in a village somewhere in China, never talking about the war, never mentioning the day he chose mercy over duty. We don't know. And we probably never will. Lieutenant Park and Lieutenant Chen both survived the war. They were reassigned to different units, kept apart for security reasons, but they stayed in touch through letters. They survived the rest of the war, went home, finished their military service. They stayed friends for the rest of their lives. They attended the same nursing conferences, met up once a year for lunch, sent Christmas cards. But they never quite able to explain to others what they'd experienced. How do you explain a moment of humanity in the middle of hell? How do you make people understand that the enemy soldier who had every reason to kill you chose to save you instead? Lieutenant Park died in 2003 at the age of 76. She'd lived a full life. Got married, had 3 children, worked as a nurse for 40 years. Her obituary mentioned her service in Korea but didn't mention this story. Because it was still classified, and even if it wasn't, who would believe it? Lieutenant Chen died in 2011 at the age of 82. Before she died, she gave one final interview to a local newspaper. The reporter was doing a story on Korean War veterans, and someone had mentioned that Lieutenant Chen had served there. She was asked what she wanted people to know about the Korean War. She thought about it for a long time. Then she said, "We were told they were monsters. They were told we were monsters. But when we actually met, face to face, both sides chose to be human. I think that's worth remembering, because we didn't have to. The war gave us permission to be monsters. Our commands expected us to be monsters. It would have been easier to be monsters. But we chose, on both sides, to be human instead. I think that's the most important thing I learned in Korea. That even in the worst circumstances, even when every incentive pushes you toward cruelty, human beings can still choose kindness. We can still choose to see each other as people. We don't always make that choice. God knows we didn't make it most of the time during that war. But sometimes we did, and those moments mattered. They didn't change the outcome of the war. They didn't save thousands of lives, but they saved 2 lives. Mine and Lieutenant Park's. And they proved something I needed to know, that humanity doesn't disappear in war, it just gets buried. And sometimes, if you're very lucky, you meet someone who's willing to dig it back up. She died 3 weeks after that interview. If you found this story valuable, consider sharing it. History isn't just about the big battles and the famous generals and the grand strategic movements that changed the world. It's also about the small moments. The times when individual people, faced with impossible choices, chose mercy over vengeance, humanity over ideology, kindness over cruelty. Those moments don't make it into most history books. They don't get commemorated with monuments or holidays, but they matter. They prove that even in the darkest times, even when every incentive pushes toward hatred and violence, people can still choose differently. Captain Wang chose differently, Lieutenant Park and Lieutenant Chen chose differently. And because they did, 2 women lived who otherwise would have died. And decades later, their story can remind us that the supposed enemy, the other side, the people we're told to fear and hate, they're capable of the same mercy and humanity that we like to think we reserve only for our own side. War makes monsters of us all, if we let it. But it doesn't have to. We can choose to be human instead. Even when it's hard. Even when it's dangerous. Even when nobody would blame us for making the easier, crueler choice. That's the lesson of Chosin Reservoir, not just the famous fighting retreat, but the small moment that almost nobody knows about, when enemies became healers and patients, when soldiers on both sides chose to honor life instead of dealing death. That moment happened. It's documented. It's real. And it's worth remembering. There's a postscript to this story that only came to light many years later. In 1998, a Chinese-American researcher named Dr. James Liu was interviewing Korean War veterans in China for an oral history project. He was in a small village in Sichuan province, talking to an elderly man who'd served in Korea. The man was reluctant to talk at first. Most Chinese veterans of Korea didn't like to discuss the war. It had been brutal, and many felt they'd been forgotten by their own government, their sacrifices overlooked in favor of more politically convenient narratives. But eventually, the old man started talking. He mentioned being in a unit that fought at Chosin. He talked about the cold, the hunger, the friends he'd lost. And then, almost as an aside, he mentioned something strange. He said his unit commander once let 2 American nurses go free, protected them, even escorted them back toward American lines when he could have taken them prisoner, or worse. Dr. Liu's ears perked up. This didn't match any of the official histories. He pressed for details. The old soldier said he'd never understood it at the time. They were supposed to hate Americans. They were supposed to kill or capture enemy personnel whenever possible. But their commander, a man he referred to respectfully as Captain Wang, had made a different choice. The soldier said he remembered Captain Wang telling them, "These women saved Li's leg. They saved Chen from sepsis. They worked for hours to help our wounded when they could have refused or run or fought. That deserves to be honored." Dr. Liu asked what happened to Captain Wang. The old soldier's face fell. He said Captain Wang died 2 weeks later in an ambush. He'd been leading a patrol and walked into American machine gun fire. He died instantly. But before he died, the soldier said, Captain Wang had written something in his personal journal. The soldier had seen it once, years later, when they were going through his commander's effects. It was a single sentence in English, probably one of the few things Captain Wang remembered from his missionary school days. "Today I chose life." Perhaps that is victory enough. Dr. Liu tried to verify this story. He searched through Chinese military archives, looked for records of a Captain Wang who'd served at Chosin. he found dozens of officers with that name. None of the records mentioned anything about American nurses. He contacted the U.S. Army, asked if they had any records of nurses being rescued or protected by Chinese forces at Chosin. It took him 3 years of bureaucratic wrangling, but eventually, he was shown the classified debrief reports. The names were redacted, but the story matched. He tried to contact the nurses themselves, but by then, Lieutenant Park had already passed away. Lieutenant Chen was in her late 70s and suffering from dementia. Her family said she sometimes talked about Korea, about a Chinese officer who'd shown her kindness, but her memories were fragmentary and confused. Dr. Liu published a paper about the incident in 2003. It was in an obscure academic journal that almost nobody reads. The paper noted that it represented one of very few documented cases of Chinese forces deliberately protecting American posts during the Korean War, and possibly the only case where they did so without any expectation of reciprocity or exchange. The paper concluded with a question: how many other moments like this happened during the war and were never documented? How many times did soldiers on both sides choose mercy when they could have chosen cruelty? And what does it say about our understanding of war that these moments are systematically erased from the historical record? It's a good question. War is supposed to be simple. Good versus evil, us versus them, heroes and villains. That's the story we tell ourselves because it's easier than acknowledging the complicated truth. The truth is that soldiers on all sides of every war are human beings, capable of great cruelty. Yes, war brings out the worst in humanity, but also capable of mercy, of compassion, of recognizing the humanity in their supposed enemies. Those moments don't fit the narrative, they're inconvenient truths, so they get classified, or ignored, or forgotten. The veterans who experience them often don't talk about them because they know people won't believe them, or worse, will accuse them of sympathizing with the enemy. But these moments happened. They're part of the history of every war if we're willing to look for them. The German soldier who let Allied foes escape. The Japanese soldier who shared his rations with a wounded American. The American pilot who refused to bomb a civilian target. The Soviet soldier who protected German civilians from revenge attacks. These stories exist. They're buried in archives and fading memories and journals that nobody reads anymore, but they're real. And they matter because they remind us of something crucial, that even in the worst circumstances humanity has ever created, even in the industrialized slaughter of modern warfare, the human capacity for kindness and mercy doesn't disappear. It gets buried, suppressed, sometimes punished, but it doesn't disappear. Captain Wang had every incentive to treat those nurses as enemy combatants. He'd been ordered to. His government expected it. His own survival might have depended on following orders without question, but he chose differently. Lieutenant Park and Lieutenant Chen had every reason to refuse to treat Chinese wounded. They'd been told these men were fanatics who'd shown no mercy to American prisoners. They could have claimed the Geneva Conventions didn't apply, or that treating the enemy violated their oath. But they chose differently, and because all of them chose differently, 2 lives were saved. Maybe 3, if you count the Chinese soldier whose leg surgery prevented fatal sepsis. Maybe more, if you count the Chinese wounded who received better care because the nurses taught proper wound treatment techniques. But even if it was just 2 lives, that matters. Because those were 2 human beings who got to go home, who got to see their families again, who got to live full lives instead of dying in the snow in Korea. War is ultimately about death. About killing the other side faster and more efficiently than they can kill you. About territory and politics and ideologies worth dying for. But in the middle of all that death, there are moments of life. Moments when people choose to heal instead of harm, to protect instead of destroy, to see the enemy as a person instead of a target. Those moments don't stop the war. They don't prevent the next battle or the next casualty. But they prove something important, that we have a choice. Even in war, even when every system and incentive pushes us toward cruelty, we can still choose kindness. Most of the time, we don't. Most of the time, war grinds on with its terrible logic, and people die, and nobody shows mercy because mercy gets you killed. But sometimes, just sometimes, someone chooses differently. And that choice echoes forward through time, a small light in the darkness, A reminder that humanity persists even in humanity's worst moments. This is one of those stories. A story that was classified for 40 years, that almost nobody knows, that doesn't appear in any of the popular histories of the Korean War, but it's real. It happened, and it's worth remembering. Not because it makes the war noble or just or anything other than the brutal, senseless conflict it was, but because it reminds us that even in Korea, even in the frozen hell of Chosin Reservoir, even in the middle of a war where 2.5 million people died, human beings were still capable of choosing mercy. Captain Wang chose mercy, Lieutenant Park and Lieutenant Chen chose mercy. And for 16 hours in December 1950, in a small camp in the mountains of North Korea, enemies became healers and patients, and the war stopped mattering as much as the simple fact that people were suffering and other people were trying to help them. That's the story. That's what happened at Chosin that almost nobody talks about. Remember it, share it. Not because it's a happy story with a neat ending. It's not. Captain Wang died 2 weeks later. The war ground on for another 2.5 years. Millions more died. Remember it because it proves that even in the worst circumstances, we can still choose to be human. Even when it's hard. Even when it's dangerous. Even when nobody would blame us for making the crueler choice, we can choose life over death. Mercy over vengeance, humanity over ideology. Captain Wang chose life, Lieutenant Park and Lieutenant Chen chose life. Perhaps that is victory enough.